John here from Ripewave Audio, and for this video we are going to continue our super review between two Denon and two Marantz AV receivers that all have support for 7.4.4 speaker layouts, that all have support for Dolby Atmos, DTS:X, and Aural 3D, that all come with Audyssey room correction, and are all upgradable for a price to Dirac Live. And furthermore, these receivers all have 9 channels of internal amplification. The main differences where these deviate on paper is on price and amplifier specification. Now there's a few more subtle details about how the displays look on the front panels and whether there's a door that opens and closes. But we're going to get into all those little differences, those nuances between these, and really try to understand if there's a justification between the entry-level price that comes with the Denon AVR X3800H of $1,700 and the premium price you pay for the Marantz Cinema 40 that comes in at $3,500, which is a $1,700 difference, or over 100% more for the Marantz Cinema 40 over that entry-level Denon. So on paper, very similar. On price, a lot different. And is that justified? This is what we aim to find out through this series of video. Now, we did a live stream a couple days ago when we unboxed these, and we did pick out a few little things at that point. We were looking at some of the physical characteristics. Now, these all come with remotes, and the Marantz remotes have its look and feel, and the Denon remotes have their look and feel. But when we started looking at these closely, one thing we noticed was the buttons are laid out and labeled the same way between tiers of products. So the 3800 and the Cinema 50, the button layouts are the same. And the same thing with the X4800 and the Cinema 40, they're the same. So what are the differences between the two tiers of products is when you go to the upper tier, you have an extra button on the remote at the top for zone 3. Otherwise, these are the same remotes between tiers. But between products, between brands, there is a difference, and it comes in the form of backlight. Marantz has this nice backlight control, which you execute with a side button on the right, and the Denon does not. Now, when you push a key, you do get a light behind the main button, and I imagine they would also have some lights on the zone, in the zone 2. But other than that, there is no illumination on the Denon remote. So it's not activated when you lift it up or push a button. So that is one thing to expect when you go to Denon versus Marantz, is there's no backlight. And I always thought there was because of just the fact that you do get a light behind at least one of them. So that's one thing that we should note right off the bat. Now, as we go through these different models, we notice some characteristics. If you compare the entry levels from Denon, so this top row is in front of me. This is the entry level. The bottom row is the next tier up. So I have all the Denon products on my left, your right, all the Marantz products on my right, your left. And if we compare the entry level lines, the main difference that we see cosmetically is the Denon unit, the 3800, does not have this door that conceals some buttons versus the Marantz does. And so this is just a door that opens and closes in the front. And some of you like that, and it's cosmetically appealing, but it's something functionally you have to get used to, that you can't access some of the buttons unless you open a door. So there are some trade-offs. the next glaring difference between the Denon and the Marantz is this large display you get on the Denon and this very small porthole that you get on the Marantz. Now, while this is designed as a cosmetically pleasing element, I don't think there's really any great functionality out of it. Now, we've been living with our Cinema 50, which is the one that's sitting here, for a few months now. We've got it when it first came out. We do look at the information that's on the porthole, but boy, do we wish that was bigger. So the display is certainly a big deal. Now, if you turn around these entry-level products and compare the back of them, all the I/O and all the speaker terminal jacks are going to be the same. And the way it handles the power input is going to be the same, and the wireless is the same. The main difference that we found was on the remote control. And so on the Denon product, the remote control in and out are done with an 1/8" phono jack, versus on the Marantz, it's an RCA jack connection. The other thing that Marantz adds that Denon doesn't have is an 1/8" input for remote infrared. So if you're going to mount the Denon in a cabinet that doesn't have line of sight to your infrared, this could be an issue. So at least not using that type of input. Moving up to the next tier, this is the AVR X4800H, which is the $2,500 unit, and the Marantz Cinema, which is a $3,500 unit. Now, we already pointed out the differences in the remote. The cosmetic differences on the front are very similar to what we saw in the lower tiers. Marantz has this porthole design, but the one thing is when you move up to this 4800 in the Denon, you do have a door that opens, and it does give you those extra buttons. Now, the Marantz also has a door that opens, but it gives you an extra feature over the Cinema 50, which is another display that essentially replicates what you would get on a Denon large display with the door open. The problem is you have to leave the door open to see the larger display, but for those of you who want to conceal it during movie viewing, you have a way of doing it. Now, the Marantz is costing you $1,000 more, or 40% more, for the Cinema 40 over the like equivalent, the 4800. Now, do we get anything more in the back of this? Well, you have the same difference with the remote control in and out. So the Denon is going to have 1/8", and the Marantz is going to have RCA plus the IR remote trigger in with 1/8" connectivity. Now, looking at these all together, you can really see how the price increases as you either move up in tier with a model or laterally across to another brand. So the entry level coming in at $3,800 at $1,700 is your baseline. If you want to move up in the Denon line, you're looking at the AVR X4800H. That's going to cost you $800 more, or 47% more. You could also move laterally over to the Marantz brand. So if you stay in the same tier of products and move over to the Cinema 50, it too is going to cost $800 more, bringing it up to $2,500, or 47% more. So either move up in tier on the Denon line or over to the Marantz, $800 more, 47%. If you move now to the Marantz Cinema 40, which is the most expensive of this lot, you're going to pay $3,500 for this model. So it's going to cost you $1,000 more over the Cinema 50 or the AVR 4800. This also comes out to be $1,800 more than the lowest one, or over 106% over the Denon 3800. So what a range in prices. Now, when we're looking at the amplification, they're all 9 channels. So with the 3800, you've got 105 watts per channel. With the Cinema 50, you have 110. And for the 4800 and for the Cinema 40, you've got 125 watts per channel. Now, these all water down when you consider all channels driven at 8 ohms to 74 watts per channel on the 3800, the Cinema 50 to be 77 watts per channel, and the 4800 and Cinema 40 coming in at 88 watts per channel. Now, these are all Class AB amplifiers. Other differences between tiers is that with the upgrade to the 4800 or the Cinema 40 gives you legacy video. You're going to get 2 composite and 1 component input if you're still using old legacy devices with this video output. The other thing that you get with the upper tier is 1 additional HDMI input. This is labeled as Game 2. So you get a total of 7 HDMI inputs versus 6 on the lower tier. Looking inside these units, we see similarities between Denon and Marantz at the same tier. So the 3800 and the Cinema 50 appear to look exactly the same inside, and the 4800 and the Cinema 40 look exactly the same inside. When you go up to the upper tiers, it seems like what they've done is improve the heatsink. They've improved the boards, they at least look differently. And it also appears that the power supply is an upgraded power supply. These are all E-core power supplies. They are not toroidal power supplies. So this gives us the rest of what we can see on paper. Of course, it really makes it a lot more tangible when we have these things in-house, and we do find errors on websites. In fact, the picture that's on the Marantz site for the Cinema 50 has this weird cover on top of the monitor 1 output, makes it look like there isn't a HDMI output there. But if you go on to other websites, they have the corrected photo there. I think this was a pre-release version or something like that. But when you get these in-house, it indeed has 3 outputs, including the monitor 1, that looks suspicious on their website to this day. At this point, we're going to get into the setup. And what we have in front of us is 4 monitors, 1 for each of these. And compare the setup. Are we going to see something different with the user experience, with the features inside of these, between models, between brands? Now, one thing that we notice right off is with all 4 of these hooked up, 2 from each brand, if you take a Marantz remote and a Denon remote, it's going to control both Denon products simultaneously and both Marantz products simultaneously. There doesn't appear to be different remote codes here. We'll look this up. We'll confirm it probably before the end of this video. But there's nothing to stop the signal from reaching both AVRs and doing the function. So they come by default with the same remote codes. So this was a little problematic, but at least I only had to push 1 button to inch these things along. They get out of sync after a while though. So let's move forward with this, and the setup menu is going to walk you through. When you first power these on, it's going to walk you through the setup assistant, and that comes on by default. You can go back to the setup assistant at any time. You just hit the setup button and scroll all the way to the bottom to setup assistant, and you can run through this again. The setup assistant is going to walk you through the way Denon and Marantz feel the majority of customers are going to have their room configured, and give a bias to using the amplifiers built into these receivers over external amplifiers. So if you're deviating from what they feel is the most common setup, you're eventually going to need to go and do some extra configuration after you run through the setup assistant, but at least get you to a point where you can start using the AV receiver and enjoying its capabilities. Keep in mind, you'll probably end up going back into the setup menus and fine-tuning this past the setup. But when you get into the setup assistant, it's going to walk you through language setup, speaker calibration using Audyssey, not Dirac, because that's what's built in, no charge. The network setup, TV audio setup, which is essentially ARC or eARC configuration, or using a Toslink optical connection, the input setup, and mobile apps. Now, what we found as we went through this, each of these models, each of these brands had the exact same menu screen, albeit some of the images on the Denon look a little different than the Marantz, but the process in which you go through is exactly the same. The language setup, the speaker calibration, the network setup, the TV audio. But when you come to the input setup, this is where it deviates, because as we just covered earlier, the more expensive products from Denon and Marantz have an additional HDMI input and also have the component and composite video. So when you're making these assignments, you have one more HDMI to deal with, but also it's giving you a choice of, are you using the video from HDMI, from composite, or component? And this is what's important. Now, other thing I'll point out here is if you just power these things up and go through the setup assistant, it's not hooked up to the internet until you get to almost all the way through and hit that network setting, which means that it doesn't have necessarily the latest firmware when you run through this the first time. We recommend always upgrading to the latest firmware. So after running through the setup assistance on these, go and make sure that you have the latest version of the firmware. Now, when you go through the setup assistant, it's going to ask you if you want automatic updates to occur. But it doesn't appear when you do so, and if you hit yes, that it's initiating that automatic process immediately. So you might still need to manually trigger that first one, or wait until whatever the next cycle is. I don't know if they're checking daily or it's waiting for a push from the Marantz and Denon servers, but keep that in mind. But it does deviate on the input for the setup assistant, but other than that, it is exactly the same. Now I'm going to walk you quickly through the setup assistant. Now, we did this before with the Cinema 50 in our video last fall, and you can always go back to that. But we'll hit the highlights. These are all the same. So I'm going to do this with the Denon, considered I did it with the Marantz Cinema 50 last fall. So it goes as you go through the language setup. It can be English, French, or Spanish. I'm going to choose English because that's what I know. Then when you go into the speaker setup, it's going to make sure that you have things in proper position. And they really talk this through for those who may be doing any sort of speaker setup for the first time in their life. So there's help buttons. They're asking you these questions about, do you have more than 9 speakers? So not counting your subwoofers, so how would you get to 9? So you could have 5 or 7 on your base layer, and then you could have your ceiling speakers. And so if you have 7 bass and 4 ceiling, that's 11. So that's more than 9. That's 2 more than 9. And we do have that. So we're going to say yes. And it says your AVR only has 9 channels amplification. So how are you going to deal with the other 2 channels that are required? Are you going to put amplifiers on your front speakers or on height 2 or none? So if you say none, I'm not quite sure what it does. It may have to have you rethink that maybe just have it so that there's 2 speakers not being used. Now we're going to use our external, we'll say we're using external amplifiers on the front speakers, which is what we recommend. And this reassignment is really nice. It's something we didn't have on the Onkyo TX-RZ50 that we reviewed just last time. But we're going to hit front, putting it on the height 2. I guess if your external amplifiers, if you feel they're not as good as what's built into these AVRs, then I would put that on height 2. But if you think your external amplifiers are better than what's built in, then put the external amplifier on the front as we are doing here. Now it talks about putting the right colored wire onto the right terminal, positive and negative, at least be consistent. So if you're putting red on positive on the amplifier, make sure you put red positive on the speaker. It even talks about stripping the wire down and how much you should be taking off, 3/8 of an inch, 10 millimeters, and then twisting that wire. So they talk you through all this. They have you put it on the speaker terminal, assuming you're just putting bare wire. Of course, we use banana plugs, but not everybody might be doing that. Then it has you connect up the whatever you might be using for your external amplifiers, and they tell you exactly what terminal on the back of the unit to use. So they work through the right front and the left front, and they get that all working. And they ask you about your center speaker. Yes, we have a center speaker, and they show you where to place those wires. And this is where our situation really doesn't work for the wizard, because the wizard is now going to assume that everything else is using the internal amplifiers. But we'll just go with it. Because the default is, this is where you don't have to worry. By default, it's going to keep powering out the speaker terminals as well as the pre-outs. And you'll find later where we can turn off the internal amplifiers. So it's saying, do you have surround sound? Yes, wire up your right surround, your left surround, your surround back speakers. Yes, so it's confirming what you already kind of said already, but it's getting into more detail. So we have 2 speakers in the back, and we'll select that. And it's saying now your right surround back and your left surround back, and we will now assist you with your height. Now there's differences in what type of height ceiling Dolby Atmos speaker you have. Obviously, we first have to say how many rows of heights we're going to have. We have 2 pairs or 4 speakers, so 2 rows in our system. Some people only have 2, or you may not have any at all. Again, it's reconfirming some of the things you've already said. And here's where you can make a choice. So on your front row, is that going to be front heights, which is something that Aural 3D prefers? Your top front is what we have built into the ceiling. Top middle, for that first row, it could be right in the middle. And then, or are they going to be Dolby reflection? So if on the top of these towers we had reflective Dolby speakers, we could use those as well. So it's very accommodating for each of these. And of course, it might handle things a little different. But I love the graphical representation. We had something similar on the Onkyo, but Denon Marantz do this as well. The other difference you'll notice between Denon and Marantz setups is Denon highlights everything in red, and Marantz highlights everything in blue. So we'll do top front here. Now they're going to ask about the second row. So it's a top rear, rear heights, surround Dolby, or back Dolby. And when they say Dolby, then talking about reflective. So here with the rear, are the reflective going to be on your side surrounds or your rear surrounds? But we, of course, have top rear, And again, if you are using Aural 3D, the rear heights would be the preferred placement if you can do that. So we said top rear, and again, it's going to walk you through how to do the wiring. So starting with the right top front, and then on to the left top front, the right top front, and the left top rear. And it says, do you have a subwoofer? Yes, we do. How many subwoofers? And this is where Denon Marantz are really unique in the AV receiver realm. They have up to 4 independent subwoofers, at least for the 3800 on up. With the models that came out of fall of 2022, we actually have 2 subwoofers. Now, graphically, they're initially showing these both being in the front, but when we make our selection, we can decide whether these are going to be standard, which is the same signal coming out of both, or directional, where the signal can be different. We're going to select directional. Naturally, we're going to try to test that out because having independent subwoofer control is something that could be a criteria for you. And then where are they located? Are they both in the front, where you have one on the left and one on the right? Or are you placing one front and one rear? Now, we are having kind of a hybrid here. I've got one on the left, which is about 1/3 of the way into the room. And then I got one on the right, which is in the rear, 2/3 into the room. So I am actually going to set front and rear because that's the closest match. And then again, the speaker setup, it's saying now come out the pre-outs for subwoofer 1 and for subwoofer 2. And the subwoofer 1 is going to be the front and subwoofer 2 is going to be the rear. It has you confirm your layouts here, and this all seems to match what we have, so we're going to hit next. And then they're going to verify that your speakers are connected, and they'll do a test tone on each of these. What you want to do is make sure that it's coming out the speaker you think it should. And that completes the speaker setup. And now it goes through calibration, which it's going to use Audyssey. For the speaker calibration, that runs with the assistant. Now this will always be Audyssey. This won't be Dirac, even if you purchase the Dirac upgrade. And they're going to ask you to use the microphone that came with your AV receiver. It's in a box that's labeled Audyssey. And it is the one I have sitting on my microphone boom stand here. It looks like kind of like the Eiffel Tower, the way it's shaped. It does come with one of these microphone stands that can be used at no additional cost. Or you can use a normal tripod if you have one of those. Alternately, you can do it what we do here with the microphone on the boom, which we find a lot easier to position, and it's less teetering on a couch or a theater chair, whatever you might be using in your listening positions. When you do this, you can skip over the speaker calibration if you know you're going to use just a Dirac Live to do your calibration. Now, just keep in mind that you're going to have to pay a fee for using Dirac Live if you choose not to use Audyssey. So it's $259 for the basic version of Dirac Live for the Denon or Marantz receivers. They're all the same price for this basic version that calibrates up to 500 hertz. So it's not doing the higher frequencies. It's doing the lower frequencies where a lot of people find it has the most benefit for room calibration. Now, if you pay an extra $100, $349, you get the full range Dirac Live calibration. It goes from 20 to 20,000 hertz. Other things you have to keep in mind when you do this. You have to use an external PC. So unlike the Onkyo has their Onkyo controller app on a mobile phone where you can run it, the Denon Marantz is more traditional approach for Dirac Live where you're running it from a laptop or PC. So you'll need that cost. And they also recommend an omnidirectional microphone over the Eiffel Tower shaped Audyssey microphone, and they also recommend on the Denon Marantz sites the use of the UMIC-1 mic, which we happen to have, but again, that's an additional charge, so that could be $80, for example. I think is the going rate for UMIC-1, but you can get them pretty easily on Amazon or something like that. When you do the speaker calibration, they have you run through an 8 position of calibration. And that is the main listening position, like an arm's length away from the main listener, to the left, to the right, and then those 3 same positions an arm lengths out. So right in front of me, arm's length, and then out into the front. So there's your first 6, and the 7 and 8 are behind you, kind of between halfway distance of your arm behind you an arm's length. So those are the 8 positions, and it works its way around the room. Now, when it's doing the first initial test of your speakers, it plays music, which is kind of nice. But then for the balancing, it's doing that whoop, whoop, whoop. And then for the actual calibration, it's doing that same thing. So it makes that tone about 8 times per speaker location. And then you do, if you have 11 speakers, plus 2 subwoofers, that's 13 measurements per measurement position. So 13 times 8. So it does take a while, maybe 20, 30 minutes to run through an Audyssey calibration. And we'll run through that with each of these. Before I do so, though, I'm going to clear out all this mess, because all this stuff sitting in front of my speakers and everything will influence the calibration of these Denon Marantz products. So I'll clear all this out and do them one at a time. And it's a bit of a pain, but that's what we'll just need to do to make this accurate. The Cinema 50, I have purchased the Dirac option. Whether I can afford to put the Dirac on these others, the problem is I think Denon Marantz tied the Dirac license to the actual model. So I'm not going to buy that 4 times. That would be over $1,000 of payment to Dirac, and for units I'm just going to return. So we may only just do the Dirac for the Cinema 50 just to get a relative impression of how much that is versus no calibration, Audyssey calibration, and Dirac. And then we'll compare these all with Audyssey and all without. So stay tuned for that. You do your Audyssey calibration. It will do some calculations on this, and it will ask you of whether you're going to use some of their special EQing. So there's the dynamic EQ, as well as their automatic volume adjustments. And that's something we can turn on and off after the fact. So we're going to get into those details later and see what differences those make. But it's an option on all these units. The next thing it has you work through is network setup. And when you do the network setup, it initially asks you if you have an iPhone or iOS device. And if you do, it makes the network setup a lot easier. So you set up, it has you go through the Wi-Fi and find the unit that is wanting to pair. And it will come up with the model number of your Denon Marantz receiver. And when you enter that, it then exchanges information, and then the IP, the network, and password, SSID and password gets sent to your receiver, and then it can use that going forward. Otherwise, you can manually scan for Wi-Fi networks and manually put in your passwords. So that's not a problem. You can connect to a WPS router. You can do manual configurations, or you can set this up to a wired LAN, and it will use DHCP connections for that. And I find that the wired is my preferred route to do this, but not everybody can run their networking cables to where their AVR is located. So after going through the network setup, they're going to have you to TV audio setup, and what they're going to have you test first is ARC and eARC. Now, I've gone through this process with Denon Marantz, and it does work. You're just going to make sure that you're plugging into the number one output for your receiver and plugging into the port of your TV that supports ARC or eARC, and then you can get this to work. You may have to do some configuration on your TV as well. So it does work. I prefer not to use ARC or eARC for the main reason of, one, I give preference to audio over video. I know not all of you feel that way, but also you lose the on-screen display if you're using ARC and eARC. So if we wire all our inputs to the TV, HDMI, and just take that audio return channel back to the receiver, when we hit the setup button, we won't see it on the TV. Now, you have the remote app with Denon Marantz, so that's a workaround if you do have ARC eARC. I just kind of like the fact that I have the on-screen display as well as a HTML web page. Now, if you don't use ARC, it will also give you an option to bring this through with Toslink optical. So a lot of TVs have a Toslink optical output. So you can use that for older televisions, or if you simply prefer using that interface. Now, with the TV audio all set up, you can go into your other inputs, and this is where we see a deviation. Now, when you go in and configure the input, it's going to give you the appropriate options as supported for the input type, whether that's going to be HDMI or video input. And when they say video, they're talking about composite video. If you go into some of them, they're going to give you component. So if you go into, for example, the setup for media player, that media player will give you HDMI or component video. If you go into Blu-ray player, it just gives you HDMI. If you go into game, it's just giving you HDMI. So you just have to play with it. So you may have to switch around which inputs you've got here, depending on the type of input you want to use. The other variation I found is if you go into CD player, you can either go digital optical from your CD player or analog. This is in the setup wizard. So we're going to see what more options you have when you leave the setup wizard and you go in and tune this, because you got to have some way to use the coaxial digital. Again, this is where the setup wizard may not work for your particular application. Don't worry, you can come back later and set it up. Just keep in mind the differences on these products. If it has an extra HDMI, which is the 4800 and the Cinema 40, those won't be available on the lower model, or as well as the component and composite video inputs. Otherwise, this is going to be a similar experience. So the whole setup wizard ends with the mobile apps. And depending on what you have for brand, Denon or Marantz, is whether you're going to use one mobile app versus another. All right, so you'll have to download. They first have you download the HEOS app. They give you a QR code to quickly launch that. You can get it through the App Store from Apple or Google Play. So they have both popular operating systems available for mobile devices. So they start with the HEOS app, and then they have you move either to the Denon or the Marantz application, depending on the brand. I believe that they do the same, but we're going to load both apps on our phone to see if there are any differences. And then finally, you have the MultEQ editor app for Audyssey. And they say that this is available for purchase. So there is a charge for the MultEQ editor app, and we'll tell you what that charge is here when we pull up that app. And then there's the owner manuals that are available. And again, they give the QR code. Remember, there's no printed manual with these. They only give you a quick start guide that is printed. And we wish they did a full printed manual. So that is the end of the setup wizard. At this point, you're on your own to see if you want to fine tune anything. When you go through the other menus, it will depend on really how you have your system configured and whether you have certain room calibration turned on or off, whether certain modes are presented or not as far as these additional configuration settings. So for example, if you haven't configured Audyssey, the Audyssey menu would not appear under audio, but it would on something that has gone through the Audyssey configuration. Having gone through the initial setup, which included calibrating using Audyssey, I wanted to figure out further what was the differences between these units, if any, through the setup process. Are there additional features or sound modes that they included? I did find a few things in looking at the menus and comparing against the manuals. One of the first things I found was some exclusive sound modes that Denon has that Marantz doesn't. And this is including the X3800 as well as the X4800 have these original sound modes be on multi-channel stereo. Now Marantz has the multi-channel stereo mode, but that's it. Denon has a rock arena, jazz club, mono movie, video game, and matrix sound modes that you won't find in these Marantz models. Now with these, there's some adjustments that you can make. There's time delays that you can put on 0 to 300 milliseconds, where 30 milliseconds is the default. You can adjust the effect level from 1 to 15. The default is 10, and that is the sound effect of the current sound mode, so how strongly it's going to be applied. And then you can adjust the room size: small, medium, which is the default, medium, large, and large. So simulating acoustics of these various size rooms. And these settings, whether it be the time delay, effect level, and room side, apply to these original sound modes that you get with Denon. These are described in many parts of the Denon manuals that show how these exclusive surround modes are applied. There are a few things that aren't really differences, but they're the way they're labeled and represented in the product. For example, there is a feature called Quick Select in the Denon products. And this is supposed to give you a quick button. There's up to 4 of these to adjust how you want for each source, whether that be your cable, your Blu-ray, your media player, or whatever, and how that aligns with a certain speaker layout or speaker preset. There's 2 speaker presets in these products, and all of them only have 2 speaker presets, but you could assign one, let's say, to Audyssey and another one to Dirac, and or be a user setting with equalization. And this could quickly select what you want for parameters when you're using a certain input, and you have up to 4 of these, so you're not having to make multiple settings all the time when you want to change those modes between various inputs. Or it could be the same input with one time you're listening to a Blu-ray player and you're using this speaker layout, and another time you're using another speaker layout. This could be handy, let's say, switching back and forth between a Dolby surround Atmos and Aural 3D, where you might have a different speaker layout. With Marantz, this same feature, which Denon calls Quick Select, is labeled Smart Select. From what we can tell, other than the name, they're the exact same thing. But they're consistent in their manuals. The Denon one always calls it Quick Select. and the Marantz always calls it Smart Select. Another instance where Denon and Marantz use just different labels is a feature Denon calls Restorer. And the idea here is to take compressed audio, whether it be MP3 or Windows Media audio, that is highly compressed, low quality, and restore this. And you have a choice of applying this either turned off, or you can do it low, medium, or high, how much you want to attempt to restore the dynamics of a compressed audio. Denon calls this Restorer. Marantz calls it MDAX. I don't know what MDAX stands for, but it is the same thing as what Denon calls Restorer. I think the Denon name is a little more intuitive. One thing I want to call out, and it's not a difference in products, but it's difference of when you're using Audyssey versus certain Dolby modes, and there are similar features. So in Audyssey, you have dynamic EQ and dynamic volume, and in Dolby, for Dolby Digital, Dolby Digital Plus, Dolby True HD, and Dolby Atmos, you have loudness management and dynamic compression. And I think loudness management is similar to what they're trying to do with dynamic EQ with Audyssey, and dynamic compression is very similar to what you get with dynamic volume with Audyssey. Now, I haven't played around with these things, but I just wanted to call out there are some similar features, and not to get confused, that are actually distinct features applied in different ways. And that's really the extent of these differences. And I thought it would help you to do a summary now with this table that I put together. And if you look at these models that range from $1,700 up to $3,500, we see a difference in amplifiers. The X3800 is 105 watts. The Cinema 50 is 110. The 4800 and the Cinema 40 are 125 watts. This is 2 channels driven into 8 ohms across for the 9 channels of amplification. When you use the 70% rule, this reduces down to 74 for the 3800, 77 for the Cinema 50, 88 for the 4800 and the Cinema 40. All Class AB amplification. So there's the differences in the amplifiers. One of the things that we've noticed was in particular that the Marantz products have just this porthole design, and it's really just too small. Denon's done well with the larger display, but of course the Marantz has brought it back with the Cinema 40 by having a larger display hidden behind the door. So that gets you to that same level as Denon. So as far as products with the door, you get it on the Cinema 50, the X4800, and the Cinema 40, but not the X3800. Now, one thing I found was helpful is to be able to do navigation on the setup menus right from the front panel of the product versus using the remote. Now, this was particularly useful to me because I have 2 Denons and 2 Marantzes, and when I try to use the remote tries to control both of them. To override this, or to get around this, I went to the front panel on those models that support it. So the navigation is on the higher end products, the 4800 and the Cinema 40. There are navigation buttons right on the front panel, and I kind of like that. One thing that was pointed out to me by Joe and Tell was that the volume and input selector wheels on the front of the X3800H were not as smooth as that on the 4800H. And he was right. The 4800 is much smoother. This is a similar experience we get with the Cinema 40, but unlike the Denon models, the Cinema 50 also has a smooth feel. In fact, I can't tell the difference between a Cinema 50 and a Cinema 40 feel on those knobs, but the X3800 is certainly feels like a lesser quality than all the other three. So that was really nice. The smooth feeling knobs on most of these, but not the 3800. As far as having illumination on the front of these, there's only one model that does it, which is the Cinema 40. And these are LEDs that shine out on the side panels of the front. And it gives a nice look, and it's very subtle. And if I turn all the lights off in the room, I can kind of see it a little bit, but it's not a really bright LED. When I get into it, I might find some other settings there, but it's illuminated. It's kind of a nice touch. As far as a backlit remote, those are only available on the Marantz products. You do not have a backlit remote on Denon. As far as the models that are here, HDMI inputs, you're going to get one more HDMI, 7 total, on the 4800 and the Cinema 40. There's only 6 on the other models. The 4800 and the Cinema 40 also have composite video, 2 of them, and component video, 1 input. There is a feature on Marantz models called the IR flasher input. So if you have a remote IR infrared sensor, you can plug it into the Cinema 50 or the Cinema 40. This is something you can't do with a Denon product in this listing. The other thing we noticed on the remote input and output, that the Denon, while it has that feature, it's only as a 1/8" phono input versus the RCA connections that are on Marantz. Now we did notice on the more expensive models, the 4800 and the Cinema 40, the boards inside of this look to be upgraded versus what you get from the 3800 and the Cinema 50. Same goes with the power supply. The original modes, original sound modes, now all of them have multi-channel stereo, but Denon gives you those 5 extra original sound modes that Marantz doesn't, and we kind of wonder why. You are paying more for the Marantz, so why aren't you getting all those features? Although we have heard that some of these rock and jazz hall and all that type sounds are not favorable with everybody. Although I've kind of liked them over the years, I'll have to play around with it myself and make a judgment there. Zone 3 control outputs to Zone 3 are only available on the upper models, the 4800 and the Cinema 50. And finally, the last difference here that we were able to pick out is that some products are made in Vietnam, the 3800 and the Cinema 50, while others are made in Japan, the 4800 and the Cinema 40. But the Marantz Cinema 40 has something that the other 3 doesn't, which is a 5-year warranty. All the others are a 3-year warranty, at least in the United States. So I'm not sure if that's so consistent globally, but they are putting more confidence behind the Cinema 40. Of course, you're paying at least $1,000 more from it in this grouping. So we put a little column off to the side here, which features were exclusive to Denon and which features were exclusive to Marantz. And we only had one feature that was really a Denon exclusive, which is those original sound modes. And we had several that were exclusive to Marantz, the illuminated LED fronts, the backlit remotes, the IR flasher inputs, the remote I/O as far as at least having an RCA connection on that, and the 5-year warranty you get on the Cinema 40 are all exclusive to Marantz. So where does this leave us? It's got to come down, probably, I'm hoping, that we're going to hear a sonic difference because everything else appears to be equal between these 7.4.4 processors, all with Dolby Atmos, DTS:X, and Aural 3D capability, all support Audyssey and all support Dirac Live after an upgrade. So it's got to come down to a sound test. And that's what we're going to be doing in the next video. And we're going to be using our ABC switcher. I started doing this comparison, but I need to put some more time in so we can do this justice and find out where this stands. We may even throw in the Onkyo and the Emotiva just for good measure to see how these all line up. So what are your thoughts on this? Are you surprised that there are really only a few differences between these models that have a wide price variation between them? What would you go with? Would you go with the more affordable option that gave you almost the same features? Or would you go to the more premium models, maybe the Marantz Cinema 40, which gives you those nice LED sides on it, made in Japan and all that? That feedback would be useful to the Ripewave audio community. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And if you want to take your involvement in this community to another level and help us out, consider our Patreon channel, www.patreon.com/Ripewave. You can always give us a one-time donation with a thanks button. We would really appreciate that. Help us do reviews like this. But you can always, at no cost to you, hit that bell notification so you'll be notified when the next video is posted. Until then, keep evolving your audio experience.